Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second legal webinar about the Web3 legal structuring. My name is Nestor, and I'm happy to welcome you to this new webinar session. And my first question will be, as usual, let's check the connection and to be sure that the screen and the voice work well for you. So please send plus to the webinar chat if you can properly hear me and if you can properly see the slides on your screen. Um, Cool. Thank you very much for the confirmation. So during our previous webinar, we discussed that how the decentralized apps might be structured. We discussed this difference between two worlds, on-chain and off-chain, and how important it is to build a proper bridge between these two worlds. Our today's topic is about intellectual property structuring for the decentralized projects. And today we will discuss what is the difference between the Web2 and Web3 IP structuring and how the Web3 founders can balance between the decentralized ownership of the IP and at the same time for the for the proper IP protection. And basically, the agenda will be the same. The first part of this webinar we will spend for the content part, and I'll discuss a bit some main concepts of this topic. And the second part of the webinar, we can discuss your questions. So you are very welcome to leave your questions in the webinar chat, and I'll try to cover as much as possible in the end of this presentation. So, just a few words about myself. My name is Nestor. I'm a co-founder of Legal Notes, and I'm also an international legal specialist working with the Web3 and blockchain companies since 2015. Since that time, I conducted more than 100 legal sessions with the experienced Web3 founders and collected some legal practices in this field, which I will be happy to share with you today, especially related to our main topic, which is the intellectual property structuring for the Web3 projects. Also, I'm a contributor to the Legal Notes blog, so you can find more articles and more like resources on this topic on the Legal Notes website. Please feel free to come and read our article, leave the feedback. Will be very thankful for it, and hope it will be useful for you. And in Legal Notes, we are working with the global network of tech-savvy, vetted legal professionals from different countries and areas of law, which helps us to provide the clients the legal help, which might cover different countries simultaneously. And basically, Legal Notes helps the founders to solve their cross-border legal matters in a single window. We achieve it in two stages. The first stage is the legal discovery session and the assignment of the virtual legal officer, who is a dedicated legal manager for the founders and who will be happy to help the Web3 founders to navigate around these complex regulations around the world, and also to find the most suitable and the most crypto-friendly countries for companies registrations, token issuances, fundraising, and DAO incorporation. And at the same time, this virtual legal officer works with our global network of local qualified legal partners. So the virtual legal officer will be happy to help the founders to engage the most relevant legal partners in different countries and manage their work, facilitate the process of the provision of legal services, which are provided by these local qualified partners, and to help the founders to check the price and time estimates for legal works, as well as the status of this work when it comes to this cross-border global legal structuring. So, coming back to okay, the the another one important moment that this presentation is not legal advice. That's a super important disclaimer for all of presentations and all resources and articles that we publish on our website. So please use it just for the informational purposes, and all the concepts that you might find on our blog, on our webinars. It's very important to double check with the qualified local legal providers. So, coming back to our main topic, and here I would like to start with the importance of the proper intellectual property structuring for the tech companies. This is the same for both Web 2 and Web 3 companies. And the three main goals of IP protection and IP structuring includes first the protection of this competitive advantage that the tech company might obtain as a result of the development of some cutting edge innovative technologies. The second is that the IP is usually the key asset of the tech company, and it results the growth of the shares of the company and its capitalization, which is also super important. And the third very important moment here is that the properly protected intellectual property is one of the requirements for the most of fundraising campaigns, because the investors and the venture firms will need to be sure that the intellectual property is fully owned by the company where they plan to invest to, and at the same time that this intellectual property is protected from different copycats and from some other IP infringements which might occur in the future. If we speak about the Web3 IP structuring, it's important to discuss the process of IP development in each of Web3 company. And it usually starts from the development of the on-chain part. On our previous webinar, we discussed a bit this difference between on-chain and off-chain parts of decentralized apps. And this is super important to understand what are the ways of IP structuring for the Web3 project, because that's the main differentiating factors when we speak about Web2 versus Web3 IP structuring. And again, this on-chain part usually includes the smart contracts, where each of the smart contract covers its own functionality or its own part of user flow in the Web3 product. It might include the DeFi protocols, the treasury management, the voting process, the DAO membership, token minting, token swap, etc., etc. So there are a lot of different types of these smart contracts, and usually the Web3 product includes this on-chain part, which is basically a system of these smart contracts, which are fully ownerless, permissionless, and fully autonomous, which means that they don't require any third-party involvement into its operations and work. At the same time, when the founders, the Web3 founders, are ready to launch their Web3 product, they start thinking about how the end users might be able to interact with this on-chain part of their project, with this smart contracts, which are decentralized and autonomous. And at this stage, the founders start thinking how they can build this bridge between the end users, who are basically the people from the real world, and at the same time with the smart contracts, which live and work in a decentralized blockchain network and are fully virtual and fully decentralized. And in this step, the off-chain interfaces come, and here the most of Web3 founders start thinking which kind of interface will work best for the end users to build this bridge for the interaction between the end users and the on-chain part of the project. Basically, such interfaces might include the websites, the mobile apps, browser extensions, chatbots, etc. And speaking about the interfaces, we can say that they are off-chain because such part of the Web3 product usually requires some centralized IT infrastructure for its existence and its work. And when we speak about this centralized infrastructure, we can say that this website or mobile apps might require the centralized hosting providers, servers, domain registrars, probably the mobile apps platforms like app stores, etc., where these interfaces might be stored and launched. At the same time, if we come back to the on-chain part, as we mentioned previously, this on-chain part is fully virtual and it lives and works in a blockchain network like Ethereum or Near or Solana or other, which means that it doesn't require any centralized infrastructure. That's the reason why the IP structuring of the Web3 products differs from the IP structuring of the Web2 products, where we can speak just about the centralized part of the project and this centralized way of IP protection. And to sum up this introduction into this webinar, we can say that, or we can split this way of IP structuring of the Web3 products into two parts. The IP structuring of the on-chain part, which is basically related to the open source, and we will cover it a bit later. And also the IP structuring of the off-chain part, which is more regular and which is mostly related to the existing traditional ways of how the IP might be protected, including the IP assignments, the trademark registrations, the patent registrations, etc. And basically, that's the main dilemma of the most Web3 founders, to balance between this decentralized ownership and the concept of permissionless of their product, and at the same time about the protection of their off-chain part, where they have a proper website, their logo, their brand, etc., etc. This results our agenda for today's webinar, which includes the following points. The first one is the main difference between the on-chain and off-chain legal IP structuring. And this is something that we have already slightly covered during this introduction into this webinar, but we will discuss it a bit later in more details. After that, we will discuss what is the open source and why it's important for IP structuring of the Web3 products. The third question will be related to the IP structuring of the off-chain part, where we will discuss the trademarks and patents, as well as the IP assignment and IP transfer. And the last question will be related to the company which will be responsible for the IP ownership. Again, we covered it a bit during our previous webinar, where we discussed this general idea of how the structure, the legal structure for the Web3 project might look like. So if you missed this previous webinar, it's highly recommended to watch it on our YouTube channel. You're very welcome for it. And in this webinar, as the last question, we will discuss a bit this one part of the structure, which is related to the dev company and its role, especially for the IP structure and IP ownership. Sorry. So if we come back to our main question, which is related to the balance of the founders between the decentralization and at the same time between the IP protection. So the main challenge related to the concept of the Web3 projects. The concept is that the Web3 projects, the end goal of all of the most of Web3 products is to become a decentralized organization. It means that there will not be any owners, beneficiaries, shareholders, or other centralized managers, administrators, or moderators. At the same time, when the process of product development starts, it usually comes to the development of some source code, and the source code should be developed by some group of the people, and then it will be important to choose the way how the source code should be protected or structured, and who will be the owner of this source code. And if we speak about the on-chain and the off-chain parts, as we mentioned previously, each of this part has its own type of infrastructure. Some of the on-chain part has its decentralized infrastructure, which is basically the blockchain network, which doesn't require, and as a result, this on-chain part doesn't require any centralized servers, domain registers, etc., etc. And the off-chain part requires a centralized infrastructure, which includes the servers, the hosting providers, the domain registers, and also some app stores or app platforms. And this results these two ways how each of this part might be structured. The main idea of IP structuring of the on-chain part as the part of Web3 product is to structure it as the open source. And the idea, the main reason why this is one of the most common approach for on-chain IP structuring is related to this concept of decentralized ownership. Basically, the open source helps the open source concept helps Web3 founders to make this source code of the smart contracts and of the whole on-chain part the ownership of the community, which means that the founders and the core team will not be the owners of this IP and will not manage it by themselves in a centralized way. And as a result, this smart contracts, this open source helps to follow this concept of ownerless and permissionless decentralized structures. At the same time, the off-chain part, which is basically centralized, and where the founders and the core team will need to confirm, for example, for the App Store or some other app platforms, that they are the exact owners of this IP before they will be able to release this apps on the third-party platforms. For these purposes, they need this IP ownership. They need this confirmation that they are the only owners of intellectual property for this off-chain part. So that's the main difference between the on-chain and off-chain IP structuring. And now I would like to focus more on the on-chain IP structuring. And as discussed previously, this on-chain development usually starts from the group of people, including the software engineers who will start the software development process. At some stage, this IP will be developed, and as this software engineers are usually hired by some company, this company we may call a dev lab company or the which means the dev company. This software development company basically will become the owner of this intellectual property. Usually it's structured in a form of IP assignment agreements, which say that all intellectual property that was developed by the third parties, including contractors or employees, is transferred to the company, which is the customer of these services. And in the end, this company, which is the only owner of this intellectual property related to the on-chain part, will publish this intellectual property, including the source code, as the open source to make it available for the community and to make the ownership and to make this IP the ownerless in terms of this decentralized concepts. When we speak about the open source licenses, because that's the very important legal matter when it comes to open source, the source code, we can say that there are different types of open source licenses, and it's very important for the Web3 founders to clearly analyze different types of open source licenses and choose the most relevant one, as each of open source license provides in its own restrictions, has its own restrictions in terms of how the source code might be used, how it might be implemented, changed, or how some new products might be built on top of this source code. And among the open source licenses for the Web3 projects, including the on-chain parts of the Web3 projects, we can speak about the MIT license and the GNU license. These two licenses are one of the most popular, and the first one will provide more restrictions, as all newly created products should be also published as the open source. The second one will provide more flexibility and more freedom to the community which might be interested to use this source code and to upgrade it, to implement it into their own solutions, etc. So that's the main points about the open source and about the on-chain part of the Web3 product. The end goal is to keep it ownerless and permissionless, and the open source helps to do this. Secondly, we can speak about the off-chain part legal structure, and that's more regular way how the IP might be structured and protected. When we speak about the off-chain part, as mentioned previously, this off-chain part usually includes the interfaces, which usually act as this bridges between the end users and the on-chain part, as the end users need to somehow interact with this fully virtual on-chain part, with the smart contracts and the protocols. That's why these smart contracts usually need interfaces, and these interfaces usually include the websites, mobile apps, chatbots, browser extensions, etc. And the best way the best way to approach this IP structure of the off-chain is to split these off-chain interfaces into different parts and then define which type of IP protection or IP transfer might work best for each of these parts of off-chain interfaces. If we speak about the website or mobile app, we can generally say that each of these type of interfaces might be divided into different parts like source code, design, logo, brand, domain name, database, etc. And each of these parts of the interface might have its own type of IP protection. For example, if we speak about the design and the source code, it's usually structured in a form of IP assignment, where the contractors and the employees who worked on these parts of the Web3 product, they transfer their intellectual property, which they developed for the company, to the company. And basically, the company becomes the only owner of this intellectual property. At the same time, if you speak about the logo, the logo and the brand is usually protected in a form of trademark, in a way of trademark registration. And the founders might think about the countries where these trademarks might be registered and receive the trademark registration certificates as the confirmation that their company is the owner of this brand and logo. And then we speak about when we speak about the domain name, it's very important to be sure that this domain name is owned by the company, and the domain name register has this information about the ownership of the domain name, which is in the DAO company. And basically, here we can move to our third question and the last one, which is related to the DAO company, which is a very important part of the structure for each Web3 project. Basically, the main role of this developed company might be divided into two parts. The first part is related to the operating matters. As we spoke previously, every Web3 project development starts from hiring people and paying salaries to them, probably renting office, and organizing this environment, this software environment for writing a source code or creating the design, etc. Which means that the different types of software subscriptions also should be paid. All these operating matters at the start of the Web3 startup journey will be covered by this develop company. And basically, this develop company is usually act as the employer and at the same time as the company which will cover all these operating matters, open the bank account, make all these payments, etc. The second very important role, which is more related to our today's topic, is about the intellectual property matters. First of all, this company will act as the IP owner for both on-chain part of the project and the off-chain part of the project, as usually these two parts of the project is developed by the same team, by the same software engineers. But when it comes to the product launch, again, to keep this on-chain part fully autonomous and decentralized, this dev company probably will publish this source code of the on-chain part as the open source. And when it comes to choosing the type of the open source license and publishment of this source code as an open source in some of the program code repository, this all matters are covered by Dell company. The same with the off-chain part, where it's necessary to register. It might be necessary to register a trademark to ensure that the source code and the design of the interfaces, I mean the websites and mobile apps, are properly transferred to the company. This part is also covered by develop company, but the way of this IP structuring differs from the on-chain IP structuring. And in the end, this company might also be the company which is responsible for this interfaces launch. This company might be reflected or mentioned in the terms and conditions of these interfaces. This company might also go through the vetting and onboarding process in different mobile third-party platforms, for example, the app stores, etc. And also, this company will be the company which owns the intellectual property and can confirm it for the investors, because the investors, especially on the early stage of the Web3 product development, will ask which company is the owner of the intellectual property of the project. When we speak about the countries where this dev company might be registered, for the operating purposes, it's always more convenient for the founders to have this dev company registered in the country where the core team is based. It will be easier to add the core team into the payroll in this country, to pay them salaries, to be directors of this company, to rent their offices there, and pay other business expenses. At the same time, in some of the cases, the Web3 projects might have distributed teams, which means that they might need to find the best country where their company might be registered. In these cases, it's highly recommended to think about, first of all, to think about the countries which have this IP/IT friendly reputation, and which are also acceptable for the venture funds. Among these countries, we can highlight Delaware in the US, the UK, Estonia, Singapore, and some other tech-friendly countries. So that's the brief overview of the criteria which might be used by the Web3 founders when it comes to choosing the country for their company registration. In the end of our webinar, I would like to sum up what are the end goals of IP structuring for each part of Web3 projects, the on-chain part and the off-chain part. So, as mentioned previously, the main goal of IP structuring of the on-chain part is to ensure that the on-chain part will be a decentralized and autonomous part of the project. That's why it's not acceptable for the most of Web3 teams to own this IP of the on-chain part in a centralized way. That's why the open source is one of the way how they can decentralize the ownership of this of this on-chain part of their project and make it an ownership of the community rather than their own centralized company. So, and at the same time, the second very important reason why the most of on-chain part of the Web3 projects are structured as the open source is to allow the community to use this source code, to upgrade it, to make the amendments, to make it better, to build new products on top of this source code, which helps to grow the community and to grow the ecosystem around this open source. At the same time, when we speak about the off-chain part, the main reasons of off-chain part structuring in a more centralized way, I mean the trademark registration, the IP transfer, the centralized IP ownership, etc., is first to being able to publish these interfaces and to launch it to the markets, because every centralized interface will need its own terms and conditions, privacy policies. In each of these documents should be the company which is responsible for this interface, and which should be the owner of the IP of these interfaces, or at least we should have the license or some other right to use this IP for launching it to the market. Also, another very important reason is to protect the logo and the brand of these interfaces and of the project at all. And the last goal, which is one of the most important, is to be able to go through the due diligence procedures of the most of the investors, as the investors will probably say which company or which entity is an owner of intellectual property of these interfaces and some other parts of off-chain part of the product. So that's all for today. That's all for the content parts. Thank you very much for listening it, and hope it was helpful for you. I'd like to make a brief teaser to our next webinars, which will be about the Web3 product launch structuring, where we will speak more about the crypto exchanges and wallets, both custodial and non-custodial, where we will speak more about the NFT marketplaces and what are the ways of legal structuring of it, and where we also cover the DeFi, GameFi, and SocialFi projects, and we'll speak about some compliance and legal matters which the most of the Web3 founders should probably take into account when launching their Web3 products. And I would also like you to invite to our future webinars, which will be related to tokenomics and token structuring, to the Web3 fundraising, and to the DAO legal structuring. So please feel free to register to come to our website, choose the Web3 webinar category, and to choose the most interesting topics for you. The last thing which I would like to welcome you is to book the Web3 discovery sessions with legal notes. If you have some questions which you would like to discuss one-on-one, and where you would like to, if you would like to make this deep dive into the legal details and some existing practices and approaches of the Web3 legal structuring on the market. And as I say, don't miss the next webinar about the Web3 product launch structuring. So that's all for today for our content part. I am very open to your questions, so please feel free to send it to our chat. I'll be very happy to cover it, to explain it, to discuss it with you. Also, if you have any feedback about the session and any thoughts or comments, what you would like to find more about on our next webinars, please also feel free to share it in the webinar chat or in our social media. We'll be happy to receive this feedback and take it into account in the future. So let's wait a few minutes for the questions, if that will be. I think that the founders, the Web3 founders, especially who started their fundraising campaigns, might face some IP-related questions. Probably the investors might ask whether the IP is structured and protected in a proper way, or probably some of the Web3 founders might think about the way how they can keep their IP decentralized and autonomous and ownerless. So that's also the question which sometimes arises when it comes to the IP structuring of the Web3. So please feel free to ask the questions, and let's wait a couple of minutes whether we will have any questions about this topic. I guess that there will be definitely some more questions on our next webinars, where we will cover the Web3 products and some legal matters when it comes to its legal structuring. So we have a question which is related to the stage where it's the most relevant to start thinking about the IP structuring. That's the very good question, because basically, as I guess the main recommendation for the most of the Web3 founders is to start signing the agreements, especially the IP assignment agreements, with their employees and contractors as earlier as possible. Because in the end, all IP should be transferred to this DAO company, and this DAO company should be the only owner of this IP. This will help founders first to pass the due diligence process with the venture firms when it comes to the fundraising, and it will be easier for the Web3 founders to publish this source code in the future as the open source and make it available for the community. So my suggestion is to start signing IP-related documents and start thinking about the IP protection from the beginning of the Web3 product development. This will help the Web3 founders to save a lot of time and cost in the future when it comes to the fundraising or to the open source. So thank you again for the questions, and thank you very much for your attention. Hope this webinar was useful, and hope your IP will be protected, and this will help you to fundraise without any legal obstacles, and at the same time to being able to open source your IP when it comes to decentralized autonomous organizations. I would like to invite you again to our next webinars, and thank you again for today's meetings. It was very nice to receive your questions and receive your feedback, and looking forward to our next webinars. Have a good evening and goodbye.